Welcome to this edition of the Irish Megaphone. Before I get going, please be sure to follow me on Twitter and other platforms. All links are in the description, so please check those out. Also, please take a moment to subscribe and click the notification button. Any material mentioned or clips used in this video will be linked and credited in the description. This video has been on my mind for a few weeks, but I didn't really know how to approach it. I wanted to put into words my view on how the Christian church has failed the Irish people over the last year. This is my point of view, and you may not agree with it, or if you're a person of faith, you may even be offended by it, but I'll put my case forward nonetheless, so hear me out. Let's get into it. I went to bed last night, but had trouble sleeping. Have you ever had that experience where you're lying on the pillow, yet your mind is racing faster than a speeding bullet? Thoughts darting in and out of your mind in no particular order. You're thinking about what happened that day, running or rerunning conversations you had, a concern you can't shake, a solution that you're trying to come up with. We've all had that experience. I think it's likely that many are having these episodes more often now, having been ambushed and lured into a Chinese Communist Party lockdown. Hold firm, stay safe, keep your guard up. We're all in this nightmare together. And, oh, by the way, here's your €300 pacification bribe to keep you sweet and pacify you while you were lulled deeper into a media-induced coma. I'm reminded of the Germanwings air crash in 2015, when the co-pilot locked himself into the cockpit, in effect locking everyone else out, as he suicidally guided the aircraft towards the Alps while he ushered everyone, trapped inside with nowhere to run, to their doom. This is where we, the passengers, are now, while the deranged narcissistic lunatics have control of the cockpit, a place where no reason or rationale can enter, while we rapidly lose altitude. All we can do now is put our heads between our legs, brace for impact, and pray. What's coming isn't going to be pretty. You think, how will I pay the mortgage? Will I have a job to return to? Am I going to lose my business? How am I going to pay that loan now without any job or income? When am I going to get that postponed hospital screening appointment? 12 months? 18 months? Will I even make it that far? The waiting list, after all, has increased to nearly 1 million. In the meantime, hospital staff think it more imperative to develop their choreographic skills. This is, needless to say, of the utmost importance in order to lift the spirits of the uncultured, non-essential workers class. We are in a pandemic, after all, don't you know? Have they no shame, I hear you ask? Apparently not. So, there I am, lying in bed, thoughts dashing to and fro, mulling over some video blog idea that has been on my mind lately. It's entitled, Why the Church Has Failed the Irish People. When I use the word church, I'm referring to all Christian churches and denominations in Ireland, including independent evangelical ones. As a Christian myself, I'm convinced that the church has utterly failed the Irish people. It has cowered down and supinely surrendered to government diktat and decree, instead of leading people out of Egypt and standing up to the regime. NEFIT and HSC recommendations have become holy writ, along with the false gospel of Martin, Varadkar and Houlihan, among others. I've noticed that some of the Christian churches even have COVID menus on their websites, full of government talking points, of course, cloaked in biblical idiolect.
Wirklich? Ja.
Oh, but if we disobey the government, we church leaders and pastors might be prosecuted. We might have to pay a fine or end up in jail. God forbid we'll end up looking bad and be poor witnesses of the gospel. Or even worse still, we could lose our tax-free charitable status. Lose it. Look bad. Go to jail if necessary. I insist, go on. It might do you the world of good. Historically speaking, it's part of your job description, isn't it? You might even grow a spine while you're there. The apostles went to jail or had other punishments meted out to them when they defied and stood up to the governing authorities. Take Acts 5 as an example. They were told, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name." But Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than men." They defied the governing authorities. Is that because they were bad Christians? No. They understood that these people giving them orders had overstepped their authority by forbidding of them what God had commanded. When government commands that which God forbids and forbids that which God commands, we've a duty to resist. So, government ordering churches to close and suspending worship and services is outside its remit.
Wirklich? Ja.
Government has now crossed the solid white line and drifted into the wrong lane. If you're driving down the motorway and some guy in the next lane starts to drift into your lane, what do? You slam on the horn as hard as you can to warn him. The Bible says, "Do not give up meeting together, except there be a virus."
Wirklich? Ja.
Oh, hold on a minute. It doesn't say that at all. It just says, "Do not give up meeting together," and there are no conditions whatsoever attached to that. That is a command. Zoom and Skype, which some churches are now in the habit of using, while it may be convenient, is not meeting together in the biblical sense. Sure, there in the past were occasions during the Spanish flu, for example, where services were cancelled briefly in a localized manner, but only briefly, not for an entire year. It was obvious then that there was a genuine pandemic because they were piling up bodies. Listen to this from an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer from 2020. It recounts some events from the 1918-1919 Spanish flu. Quote, "A century ago, the deaths came so fast that morgues, cemeteries, and funeral homes like my great-grandfather's couldn't keep pace. In some Philadelphia neighborhoods, flu deaths became so commonplace that survivors sometimes wrapped the contagious corpses of recently deceased relatives in sheets and set them out on their front porches as if disposing of litter. Then, city work crews utilizing converted garbage trucks collected the bodies." End of quote. That's what a real pandemic looks like historically, as opposed to a media fabricated one.
Wirklich? Ja.
Some Christians will say, "Oh, but Romans 13 says that we have to obey the government authorities because they have been given their authority from God." Yes, it does say that. But that authority is limited and only applies to a government that is acting righteously or uprightly. No government has a right to do wrong, regardless of what the Bible says. Government has not been given unlimited authority by God, so its power must be used in accordance with and in agreement with God's laws. That's the correct context. Anything outside of that is an abuse and usurpation of power over the lives of men and women whose natural God-given rights it purports to and has a duty to uphold. So, I hear a knock on my door and I have some Jews hidden in the attic. I open the door and I see some...
Heil Hitler.
They ask me if I'm hiding some Jews, and like a good Christian, I tell them that I am.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Heil Hitler.
Because I don't want to lie, right? Because lying is a sin, right?
Wirklich? Ja.
No, of course not. They're engaged in wrongdoing.
Do you have Jews here?
Of course not. It is against the law.
I am under no obligation to comply with and partake in their wrongdoing. I am obeying God by not complying.
All right, you tell me straight. Are you lying to him?
We're not obliged to tell the truth to everyone who asks. Only to God.
And Ruder?
He's got no right to the truth.
No?
No. Well, consider this. If A teacher asks a boy in front of the whole class if his father came home drunk again the night before. Is the boy obliged to answer yes?
No.
Exactly. The teacher is abusing his power in asking that question. The honest answer is for the boy to lie, defending his father. And lie for all he's worth.
In this clip recounting an essay by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the teacher, by asking that question, is exceeding his authority and thus has no right to the truth at any cost. The cost in this example would be the child having to dishonor the father by revealing the father's weakness. So, by withholding the facts, the child is in reality honoring the parent and thus coming into alignment with God's principles. Honor your father and your mother. Exodus 20, verse 12. Let's take another example, which I will refer to as hypothetical lest I get censored by the big tech gods. Let's say a mendacious government or group of governments have agreed to impose a certain series of measures upon its citizens. It goes about this by claiming there's a magic virus that is so deadly, it requires a test to know if you have it or not, and also requires shutting down the country for a full year.
Sieht wirklich nicht gut aus.
Ja, dann hoffen wir mal, dass Sie sich nicht anstecken.
But 2 weeks at first, just to get the ball rolling. Sure, didn't the CCP do it in China, so it must be okay, right? This imagined government, for example, then sets up an unelected medical board which has no virologist or epidemiologist, giving it the power to suspend all civil liberties, including the right to worship in church. A power which it both proceeds to and delights in enforcing. The consequences of said enforcement is the denial of most citizens' ability to earn a livelihood. This will naturally result in the destruction of the whole country economically.
Wirklich? Ja.
This economic certitude is then hidden from most citizens, who are encouraged to pacify themselves on Netflix, online shopping, and positive affirmations. To believe otherwise is unthinkable, so they put their faith in government and its message.
Was? Aber die Regierung will doch nur, dass die Menschen glücklich sind. Verstehst du das nicht?
And besides, they have been given a financial gratuity to placate them, so they will go along with the program. In the meantime, in this state of Narnia, some concerned or intrepid citizens, let's call them conspiracy theorists, don't allow themselves to give in to government-controlled media and decide to delve into the claims that are being made. 4,000 deaths out of a population of 5 million? Can one call that a deadly pestilence, they ask? The deaths for the previous 5 years are more or less the same, when there was no such crisis, and official statistics then show that most of those 4,000 actually had other illnesses, such as cancers and so forth, meaning that they were already at high risk of death within 4 months.
Wirklich? Ja.
Now, would these intrepid citizens be right to think that something is not quite right here? After all, one swallow does not a summer make. What if they then discovered that the unapproved test for this deadly disease was highly unreliable and had a false positive rate of up to 96%?
Wirklich? Ja.
Furthermore, they discovered that the daily case rate were merely those who had tested positive for this unreliable test, which is the new definition of a case, meaning these so-called cases were actually perfectly healthy people with no symptoms at all who decided to get tested because the government told them they should. It's the responsible thing to do, you know. So, these perfectly healthy people have now been convinced that they are in fact ill. I'm reminded of Siegfried Sassoon's First World War poem, Base Details, where the majors at the base, quote, speed glum heroes up the road to death, end of quote. Now, the linguistic mantra asymptomatic is rolled out. This is the magic spell that convinces the suggestible. These glum heroes rush home to zealously imprison themselves for 14 days and toddle safely home to die in bed. Does this hypothetical scenario not sound absurd? Well, look around you. Getting back to our previously mentioned intrepid citizens and their line of questioning, which barely scratches the surface of investigative inquiry, yet anyone can do it and the answers are easily found for those who want to find them. Ask yourself this: wouldn't it be obvious that under such a scenario, this imagined governmental authority would in fact be deceiving or even lying to its own citizens, even if it's by half-truth or omission?
Wirklich? Ja.
Given that such deceit would cause life-altering damage and destruction throughout the general population, would the citizenry then really be obliged to comply with such abusive diktats and unjust laws?
Do you have Jews here?
Of course not. It is against the law.
Of course, standing up to and disobeying such authority also comes with the risk of personal consequences. So, be aware of this beforehand. Keep people informed, yes, but please don't cry a river about it later on social media. Historically, this risk is part of the resistance package for those who choose this route. Not everyone can. There was a recent piece on Gript Media where a representative of an Irish-based Christian organisation expressed their views regarding the effects of the lockdown. Christian Voice, according to their website, represents over 80 churches on the island of Ireland, and the role of church and society was discussed. While physical needs are indeed of importance, we are undeniably more than mere physical beings. Mental, emotional, and spiritual needs are also of value, and these needs are often met by many church fellowships for countless individuals. The suicide rate is on the rise. The elderly are being prevented from seeing family, loved ones, and friends. The loneliness and despair some of these people feel must be horrendous, not to mention those whose family are being kept from them as they breathe their last on this earth. And then only 10 can attend the funeral? What kind of special madness is this? Then there are all those who are losing their businesses and livelihood, can't pay their rent, mortgages, or meet basic commitments. There are those who will have no job to return to when all this is over, but the pandemic payment is camouflaging that from them, so shallow is their foresight. I was told recently by one of my siblings that their spouse has knowledge of people who are literally going hungry and was donating food to help out.
Wirklich? Ja.
A man or a woman has a right to a livelihood. In fact, according to the Bible, it is a command and not a suggestion. If a man does not work, he shall not eat, right? What about this in Proverbs 16:3? Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. This is the way God has ordered things, whether you believe in him or not. So it applies to all of society. In the same way that thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not steal applies to all, not just Christians. So, what happens when a government orders you not to work and not to earn a livelihood?
Are you employed, sir?
Employed?
It is against the law.
Which enables you to look after your family and your needs. Who now is violating God's principles and commands? The government, of course. But the government is giving us PUP money, I hear you say.
Wirklich? Ja.
Yeah, sure. And where is it getting that from? And how is it going to be paid back? Where was the cost-benefit analysis of this lockdown? Oh, there wasn't one. Luke 14:8, quote, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Or how about this one from Proverbs 22:7? The borrower is slave to the lender. Slavery, that's what's ahead now for this country. Given that we now live in a secular and post-Christian society, doesn't it now make sense why people gave in to this government decree so easily? The government has taken on the role of God, which it believes means that it can decide who should suffer and who should not, who is allowed to work and who cannot.
Was? Aber die Regierung will doch nur, dass die Menschen glücklich sind. Verstehst du das nicht?
However, God says that all work is essential. John from Christian Voice said in the interview in Gript that they had written 3 letters to the government asking for permission to open up, but have as of yet not received a satisfactory reply. That's fine, but I have a question. Why are you asking the government for permission to open your doors?
It is against the law.
You already not only have permission, but a command from God's word to do so. Do not give up meeting together. What are you waiting for?
It is against the law.
Isn't it clear that the Irish government opposes what God has commanded? If the churches had stood up, took action a year ago and defied these ungodly decrees, I believe the whole country would have followed suit. The opportunity was lost, however. While I was preparing this edition or podcast or whatever you want to call it, I heard Irish YouTuber Thomas Sheridan say a few days ago that the church in Ireland has stabbed the people in the back. Now, this is from someone who says or claims to be a pagan. I cannot disagree. He hit the nail on the head. You see, this is what happens when one has faint-hearted jellyfish in the pulpit, I'm sorry to say. So how did the government so easily shut down all the Christian churches without any resistance? The answer is because the Christian churches think they have to obey everything the government says, and because of a false understanding of Romans 13, combined with a little bit of cowardice.
It is against the law.
This is what happens when you have Christianized Marxism in the form of social justice, instead of biblical justice being preached from the pulpit, or even subjecting a congregation to large video projections of Greta Thunberg, accompanied by a pep talk on sustainability.
How dare you!
Which as a guest I personally witnessed in a church just over a year ago. I kid you not. Now, these I'm sure are all very well-meaning people, but with all this carry-on going on in many churches, not all, but many, why would you be surprised that many churches and Christians are now lockstep in full synchronization with state narrative?
Wirklich? Ja.
Recently, I've been reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's biography by Erich Metaxas. The title is Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, and I highly recommend it. Bonhoeffer was hanged by the Nazis in April 1945 for his role in the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, and as well as being a pastor, is probably one of the great theologians of the last century. Bonhoeffer's observations at the time was that some well-intentioned Christians were so blinded to Hitler's true nature that they naively reached out to Hitler in the hope of converting him, when they might better have spoken out against him.
It is against the law.
On September 15, 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were announced. These were a more ordered phase of persecution of the Jews, which started to erase their German citizenship. The laws forbade them to marry German citizens, employ female German citizens under the age of 45 as domestic workers, and so forth. This is a quote from Metaxas' book. Bonhoeffer saw the enactment of these laws as an opportunity for the confessing church to speak out clearly, in a way they had not yet been able to do. The Nazis had drawn a line in the sand and everyone could see it. But the confessing church was again slow to act. It was guilty of the typically Lutheran error of confining itself to the narrow sphere of how church and state were related.
It is against the law.
When the state is trying to encroach upon the church, this is a proper sphere of concern. But for Bonhoeffer, the idea of limiting the church's actions to this sphere alone was absurd. The church had been instituted by God to exist for the whole world. It was to speak into the world and to be a voice in the world, so it had an obligation to speak out against things that did not affect it directly. End of quote. The confessing church, by the way, were the Christians who refused to come under the authority of the Reich, unlike what became known as the German Christians of the Reich Church, who submitted to and swore an oath to Hitler. You could almost argue that the Reich Church viewed the confessing church as the conspiracy theorists' wing of German Christianity of the day. The reality, of course, was that the German Christians' Reich Church were the ones that had moved away from the truth into statism.
Was? Aber die Regierung will doch nur, dass die Menschen glücklich sind. Verstehst du das nicht?
In 1937, more than 800 confessing church pastors and lay leaders were arrested or imprisoned, including their leader, Martin Niemöller, whose last sermon before he was arrested included the following, quote, "We have no more thought of using our own powers to escape the arms of the authorities than had the apostles of old. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak. For it is and must remain the case that we must obey God rather than man."
It is against the law.
That Thursday he was arrested. End of quote. Bonhoeffer had 3 essential points regarding resistance to state abuse of power. 1. Christians in the church have a duty to speak out and rebuke the state when it steps out of its delegated area of jurisdiction or abuses its power. 2. Christians in the church have a duty to defend those who are victimized by the state, whether these victims are part of the church or outside of it. 3. Christians and the church have a duty, when all else fails, to put a spoke in the wheel of state machinery as a form of resistance. Of course, we are not in Nazi Germany now. However, these basic biblical principles outlining how we are to deal with the state are transferable from generation to generation because they are eternal in nature. We have to use our own discernment in how we apply them to our current circumstances, whatever they may be. And not everyone is called to respond in the same way. So, to reiterate, Romans 13 does not give government unlimited power. Any power it has been delegated to it with certain limits. Neither does it require unlimited obedience. Again, when government commands that which God forbids, and forbids that which God commands, we have a duty to resist. Finally, back to my sleepless night. I did sleep eventually and woke the next morning with a quote on my mind. The quote is from Thomas Paine, one of the American founding fathers, taken from his book Common Sense, which I read some years ago, published in 1776. This sentence stopped me dead in my tracks when I first read it. So much so that I decided to memorize it. It appears in the opening paragraph of the book. For those of you who have been completely swept up in the COVID media fear narrative, please pay attention now. Listen. Quote, "A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right." I'm just going to repeat that. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. End of quote. So let's unpack that. Not questioning whether something is wrong or not will passively settle it in your mind as being correct. Or when you allow certain beliefs or information to wash over you without questioning them, you will come to believe they are true, whether they are or not. I'm going to finish by reading the last few sentences from Albert Camus' novel The Plague, which I read recently. The Plague was written in the wake of France's occupation during the Second World War. The moral of the story is that totalitarianism is always lying dormant, patiently waiting for its opportune moment to resurface. Before I do, however, I want to tell you about Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian peasant farmer who, because of his faith and faced with execution for treason, refuse to take the oath of allegiance to Hitler or fight for the Nazis. His story is told beautifully in Terrence Malick's film, A Hidden Life. There's a scene in the prison where eventually he is presented with a document containing the oath, which will save him from execution. Sign this and you will go free, he is told. I'm already free, he replied. On August 9th, 1943, he went to the guillotine. Meanwhile, in 2021, we are writing letters asking for permission from a government for that which is not theirs to give. Just like Chamberlain in Munich, naive but well-meaning Christian churches gave up a few inches, while the gangsters in government took 10 miles. Christian leaders, your allegiance is first to God and then the people, not to a political government that has its own agenda. The time for letter writing has long passed. Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. The churches now need to rid themselves of the robes of appeasement and go to war.
Oh, fuck it.
Oh, fuck it. Yes, that's your answer. That's your answer to everything. Tattoo it on your forehead. Your revolution is over, Mr. Lebowski. Condolences. The bomb's lost. My advice to you is to do what your parents did. Get a job, sir.
It is against the law.
Indeed. As he listened to the cries of joy that rose above the town, Rue recalled that this joy was always under threat. He knew that this happy crowd was unaware of something that one can read in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, that it can remain dormant for dozens of years in furniture or clothing, that it waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, and old papers, and that perhaps the day will come when, for the instruction or misfortune of mankind, the plague will rouse its rats and send them to die in some well-contented city.
The bombs will always lose. Do you hear me, Lebowski? The